So very good evening to all of you. At the outset, let me thank Learning General Surgery, Dr. Patta Radhakrishna, for giving this opportunity. You may be wondering that why did I divide this intra-abdominal sepsis or infection into two parts. Before we go to the actual topic, yet another favorite quote. So when I is replaced by we, even illness becomes wellness. I hope and wish all of us work together for the eradication of the COVID infections, which is a pandemic spreading across India. So let there be wellness for each and everyone. That's what I pray. So intra-abdominal infections or sepsis means, the most challenging situation. It has got as such very high mortality. In the last class, I talked about mainly GI surgery problems such as perforations and gangrene. These are the two common things which everyone knows. Whenever an acute abdomen or a sepsis in the abdomen is diagnosed, everyone may narrow down to perforation and gangrene. There are few areas which are not truly maybe intra-abdominal, but they are part of abdomen. That is one of the important reasons why I selected to choose as a second part of, which includes, we'll know soon. The mortality, morbidity, all lies in the surgeon factor, his experience, how much he's handled such cases. Yes, patient factor, elderly group, many diabetics, many cardiac problems, they're all living longer nowadays. And of course, the bacterial load. This, what I'm trying to tell here is the load which I mentioned last time for the colon. But remember, whether it's a cholangitis, whether the urosepsis, the bacterial load also decides. So keeping all these things in the mind, I had divided in that class only into part 1 and part 2 because my today's class is to sensitize all of you to this. I have called it as a non-gastrointestinal purposefully. Strictly speaking, I may be wrong, but hepatic, biliary sepsis, pancreatic sepsis, and few important things such as in urosepsis and gynecological causes we'll be discussing. When a patient arrives in an emergency department with the hypotension and shock, you always get confused, and you should be quickly, decisions have to be quick here because a delay will definitely cause a danger and death. So the reason why I have divided into two sections. So quickly, the ones which are basics. When you say uncomplicated means infection confines only to that organ, say maybe an appendix, maybe gallbladder, it has not spread beyond. But when it spreads beyond, that is called as complicated. Classical examples, acute cholecystitis, as long as it is confined to the gallbladder, it is uncomplicated. Maybe with the perforation, maybe a pericholecystitic collections with or without local and general peritonitis, it becomes complicated. It can also be primary, secondary, tertiary. I have given last time all the details. So some of them are sterile. So foreign body can also give rise to a sterile necrosis, the peritonitis. Now, so with this introduction, we'll go to the important causes from the liver. So all of you know that this is actually other surface. All you can work out that is a bare area of the liver, showing the most common site of amoebic liver abscess. You can also get a pyogenic liver abscess from many sources, and one dangerous condition is cholangitis. These three will be discussing more, but let me also say that this is also to be kept in mind. So it's basically a portal pyemia, means suppurative pyelophlebitis. There is a pus in the portal venous system. You know that portal vein drains the entire, you can call as a GIT, except the last, the few portion 2 or 3 centimeters. So of the anal canal, and so that is the reason. So any lesions involving this area, common ones including an appendicular abscess, Even a hemorrhoidectomy patient has developed portal pyemia or diverticulitis or a gangrene. All of them can give rise to a portal pyemia, septic thrombosis, portal vein thrombosis, all sorts of complications, even a death has been reported. So it's important that a portal pyemia is a dangerous condition, and you know it is a GI sources. Usually the sepsis is E. coli, Klebsiella, etc. So one should be able to treat them as early as possible. So all of you know that in India it's quite common. No doubt it is much less now than what I and others have seen. Maybe because the metronidazole has made a tremendous difference. All of you know that it is a fecal-oral contamination. It is the cysts which are dissolved and liberated into trophozoites, especially in the colon, cecum as well as the sigmoid. People who are travel along, you know, multiple travels and some other few countries, India, Africa, Mexico, etc. But it's about 2 to 5% of the intestinal amoebiasis goes for a liver abscess. So that is a small story or the history. A Mexican who reaches Spain, and you know, he is supposed to be promoted viceroy. There's a book actually, they published in the book just for historical sake. And within 6 months, he's supposed to become a viceroy. He dies, and you find that concave part of the tip of the liver, where it touches the rib, you know, eggs worth of putrid matter. So probably what they were talking is actually a amoebic liver abscess. So you know that the pathogenesis, basically it is the colon I mentioned to you. Amoebic inflammation of the cecum is called as amoebic typhlitis, and sigmoid is the area where you get the sigmoid dysentery. I think all of you know. The spot on the right side is almost mimicking the appendicular point because that's the cecum there. But spot on the left is corresponding the appendicular point, what has been called as Sir Philip Manson Barr's amoebic point of tenderness. Whatever it is, this is the source here. Trophozoites enter now, and to the portal vein, ultimately they reach the right lobe. Right lobe is bigger, and bare area of the liver is extraperitoneal area, and that's the place where you get the amoebic hepatitis initial state. Later it gives rise to liquefaction necrosis, and you get a amoebic liver abscess. I think all of you know about this. The classical way to elicit is that intercostal tenderness there. So he may give history of loose stools, may or may not be present. Chills and rigors are present. Typically it's a tender hepatomegaly. There are 2-3 differential diagnoses you should know in the surgical wards, apart from the hepatitis, for a very tender hepatomegaly. One being amoebic liver abscess. Then you can say hepatoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, rapidly growing sometimes. And don't forget congestive cardiac failure. Before the days of ultrasound, I know the incidents where a postgraduate was about to put those days, it was a Malakoff's tube, almost there, big liver, tender liver, and it was congestive cardiac failure. So please take care of this precaution. Whenever you decide a tender liver to be evaluated, also remember congestive cardiac failure apart from hepatocellular carcinoma. More so in India with the fever, HCC, hepatocellular carcinoma, also presents with the fever. But this is a tender hepatomegaly, chills and rigors, intercostal. There's some kind of an earthy complexion. Mild jaundice may be present. Of course, that's just another picture showing a anchovy sauce. So typically leukocytosis enzymes may be elevated. And today, the ultrasound shows hypoechoic. Always remember, don't do that. Ultrasound is echo. CT scan is density. It's a low density. We can have a peripheral enhancement. And if you do an MRI, it's a intensity, low signal intensity in the T1, but T2 may show high. So it's a very sensitive, but facility may not be available, may not be required. In fact, ultrasound today as good as it can give all the information, so one can rely upon ultrasound. And that's what a CT, if you do, they talk about Hounsfield units there. You can see the wall there. edema. So you can say almost 3 layers there. There's an abscess there, wall. This is actually, you can see here, hypodense lesion, wall and a peripheral edema. Septations may or may not be present. It can be single or multiple. Remember the complications which we don't see nowadays, that is a rupture through the diaphragm into the lungs. Even we have earlier days, the ricardial effusion also has been mentioned, described very well for a amoebic liver abscess. Disease is still common, but may not be that common like what you see. So drug of choice is metronidazole, very effective. You can also give paromomycin. So, or you can also add iodoquinols. And sometimes they may not respond. Injection emitin, I have not written here. Not very commonly used drug. It can still be used a cardiotoxic drug. So there's a separate rules you have to follow. Monitoring of the ECG, blood pressure, all these are required. So that's how we treat a liver abscess. And today you have ultrasound, you diagnose it, put a pigtail catheter, and you can see the picture here showing how the normal temperature it has reached. So there used to be a teaching of amoebiasis cutis. With the advent of this metronidazole and other drugs, I am yet to see the amoebiasis cutis. So that's not a complication at all today with the good anti-amoebic treatment. Yes, in spite of fever is persisting, but one important other complication which you may encounter in trauma or a casualty emergency department is ruptured abscess. Still, once in a while, you do patients come with the peritonitis. They may not have that all that classical guarding rigidity of a peptic ulcer perforation or enteric, but there is definitely an upper quadrant is involved. Tenderness, they may have hypertension, so they may require an emergency laparotomy, drain the pus, irrigation, wash the cavity, etc. So that's all about the amoebic liver abscess. With this, we'll go to the pyogenic liver abscess. Liver is one area where a lot of, it's a porta, basically a porta, where portal vein enters, hepatic artery enters, and hematogenous spread, bile duct enters. So all this, anything which is connected to these three, you can develop abscesses. They are usually multiple sometimes, and polymicrobials. So E. coli to Klebsiella pneumonia, so many have been described. But one important thing you should remember that patient with the multiple abscesses may require a long-term antibiotic. So you can see the various routes here. As I mentioned to you, portal vein means you can think of the entire GIT, can give rise to source here. Starting from diverticulate to ulcerative colitis, anything for that matter. Common bile duct, two important things are the stones you should remember and a stricture. Stones and the stricture. Yes, periampullary carcinoma with cholangitis, ERCP. Hepatic artery, part of septicemia process, not that all that common, but unless person is immunocompromised. The few other things have been mentioned, not very common. So basically, pyogenic liver abscesses are multiple because the route of entry is through the portal vein there, and the usual source is in the abdomen. So that's the route of infections. So, and some bacteriology statistics is here. So you should know this so that you know what drugs to give. Enteric bacteria, there are some of them are E. coli, Klebsiella, some others group also there, and staphylococci. So in other words, the basic mandate in surgery is always to send the culture sensitivity before you proceed with any specific treatment. So there's a typical, I think it's not difficult to diagnose today with the imaging facility, typical pain, clay colored stool, dark urine, fever, night sweats. So that's how you make a diagnosis of a liver abscess. And basic dictum for any today is we have got ultrasound guided aspirations, percutaneous drainage. So irrigation, all that is first has to be taken care of. And only when it is not possible, then only you open or a laparoscopic method. So we have discussed amoebic liver abscess and pyogenic. These two are common. But one other conditions postgraduates or everyone should be sensitive is about this cholangitis, because this cholangitis is something which can take away life within 2 days or 2-3 days. You don't know what time in the middle of the night in emergency department you were called to see one woman who has got high grade fever, chills and rigors, hypotension and shock. That's how it happens. The events are so fast, especially diabetic. There are two important sources here. One is an obstruction, another is infection. So that is the whole aim of treatment of cholangitis, is to relieve the obstruction and then infection. So it is the stasis and bacterial colonization happens in the CBD, and the result is cholangitis. There are a few simple things to remember for you when a patient has got hypotension, shock, a woman especially. If you suspect, these are the 5 or 6 C's you can remember there, na? Easy. Does she have a gallstones or CBD stones? Previous history may give a clue, or intermittent fever she might have had, or has she undergone ERCP? This is a common problem in the ward you will come across sometimes. After 2 days, you will be called again to see, oh, there's a patient who has undergone, or a patient has a cholecystectomy stricture. What is this cholangiopathy? What happens is today, especially is mentioned more for a liver transplantation, following a liver transplantation, or a trauma, or radiation has been given for some other cause. Whatever be the dissection in and around that Calvert's triangle area, difficult cholecystectomies. So because the CBD gets blood supply only from the hepatic artery, you should remember this. Whereas the liver gets from both hepatic artery as well as a portal vein. So CBD gets the blood supply from all the peribiliary, vaso, all those capillaries, right? So that is the important thing which can give rise to what has been called as cholangiopathy or ischemic narrowing or stricture of the CBD. You may say that it was a difficult cholecystectomy. I have done all the things well, but patient can come after 3 months later with the stricture. One of the reasons described is this, especially if you have skeletonized the CBD little longer. Cholangitis, primary sclerosing cholangitis can give rise to multiple strictures, and of course not common in India, but of course we have ascariasis for that. That's a Clonarchis sinensis or primary Asiatic cholangiohepatitis. So one of the things you should always remember in an obstructive system, dye should never be injected. For some reason, if you inject the dye, you should drain it. Because I have seen this, one of the common question which is asked in an obstructive jaundice, especially for postgraduates, when you say periampullary carcinoma, what investigation you do, you will invariably tell ERCP. You may not mean that, but you should remember ERCP is never done. It's only endoscopic, side-viewing scope and biopsy. That's all answer expected. Because in case if you inject the dye and you are not relieved the obstruction, it's a sure septicemia, cholangitis. So these are some of the common causes. So what is the normal mechanism? You may say that why we don't get cholangitis. One itself is that sphincter of Oddi. You know, it functions very well. Only the signal should come from cholecystokinin from the gallbladder, then the bile has to flow, then only it opens. There is a normal biliary pressure is low, 8 to 12 centimeters of water, whereas it is more. In the duodenum, bile flows freely. There is a continuous forward flow of the bile in the duct. It flushes bacteria. There's a saying called as a flowing water. May be contaminated, but still it is, you can drink it. Flowing water. Something similar here is the forward flow of the bile. And bile salts and immunoglobulins secreted by the epithelium of the bile duct, they also have a protective role. So these are some of the important points which normally protect someone from developing cholangitis. So as I told you about pathophysiology, there is to start with, there is a bacterial contamination and there's obstruction. And increased pressure, what happens now? There's an obstruction, let us say stone. When it goes beyond 20 centimeter water, you know, it widens the space between the lining the cells of the duct. You know, they have got a lining epithelium. So this bile, which is contaminated already with the bacteria, obviously it can come in contact with the cells. Now, there is some important function of the Kupffer cells. You know, these are actually protective, you know, they specialize macrophages. But what happens, their function is also affected. Then there is increased biliary pressure. decreases production of immunoglobulin, especially IgA, which is normally present. I mentioned to you, protective mechanism. So now you know the reason why this is cholangitis sets in. So there is a bacteremia. The initial part is always SARS. It's easy. And then there is obstruction. And ultimate result is, you can see the capacity to fight the infection is not there. Immunity is affected. And the cytokines are liberated. So cholangitis is the result. And these are some of the statistics about the infective organisms here. So you can see major is E. coli, and rest of the other things have been given here, including Clostridium, you can see here. And so diagnosis, you should have a high suspicious. Patient has a jaundice, patient has itching, known patient, she may have a stone there, or some instrumentation has been done. She may be taking some oral contraceptive pills or fibrates. Fibrates are nothing but the drugs which reduce your triglycerides. You know, they also got a increased capacity of producing the biliary infections. So these are some of the important things. All of you know the Charcot's triad. Intermittent words should come: intermittent pain, intermittent fever, intermittent jaundice, and progression is for hypertension and altered mental status or confusion, what has been called as Raynaud's pentad. So what are the risk factors for cholangitis? So that is important here. Females, again, as I mentioned to you, very fatty female, we may be having a stone itself. Old age, patient with a renal failure, all medical comorbidities, and of course the pH 7.4 or less, bilirubin is more than 90 micromoles. These are the poor prognostic factors. You should know how to convert the micromoles into the deciliter or milligram percent. It's a simple equation of 5 you calculate. Okay, 5. So that means if it is, you can see here, this bilirubin 1 means it's usually 5. So this is how we normally calculate the micromoles and the milligram percent. So these are some of the risk factors for developing cholangitis. So it's one of the most dangerous condition in the liver, can kill somebody very fast. So it's important to diagnose with the leukocytosis. Then you have got this liver function test. Blood culture should always be taken, and normally CBD is less than 6 millimeter diameter, except post cholecystectomy. So in others, if it anything more means, you may suspect with this picture, with the picture of sepsis, CBD may be the cause. So the resuscitation is equally important here. Investigation, resuscitation should go simultaneously. IV fluids you start, and obviously third generation of cephalosporins and metronidazole, and depends upon your hospital infectious department guidelines, because some of the source can be from the hospital, ERCP, etc. So that's how basically early diagnosis, early resuscitation, and removal of the septic focus very fast. That constitutes the cholangitis treatment. Just for a few images only. This was our case of hydrated cyst. Here you can see the typical cartwheel, and that has ruptured into the CBD and caused all this, you can imagine. So these were extracted not only from the liver, few of them are extracted from the common bile duct also. And this is a ascariasis, removed from the common bile duct. We have ascariasis, not a Clonarchus sinensis. So what's the treatment now? Basically, you have a papilla problem of cholangitis, papillary stenosis or sphincterotomy, or you can basket it. Stricture means dilatation. Basically, drain the system with or without a stent. Usually, stent is put. Right. Now, for some reason, you don't have the facility for ERCP, or you can't do. Earlier, it was considered as not a good option, but today with the increasing imaging and increasing expertise, you can see here, they have drained almost 100% of the cases. That means results from the PTBD are also as good to drain the system. Please remember, it is to drain. It may not extract the stone from below, but that's what is important. So it's an emergency PTBD here. So is indicated in acute cholangitis. So major advantage is that, you don't require anesthesia. So hemodynamic unstable patient also can undergo. After all, it needs a very small local anesthesia and one catheter. That's all. System is dilated, but disadvantages are there sometimes, because patients in sepsis, they always have some morbidity, clotting dearrangements. Their prothrombin time may not be normal there. So thrombocytopenia. So these are some of the problems. But remember, an option when expertise of ERCP is not available, experts in the PTPD claim of better results for draining the system than proper treatment. Yes. So we have discussed important causes from the liver. There may be many few others, which is for all of you to go and read. So amoebic liver abscess, I have mentioned. Pyogenic, which also can be a part. Infected hydatid cyst, I have not mentioned purposefully. And cholangitis. These are the three important causes from the liver. So now we'll go to the duodenum. The first one I have already mentioned to you last time about the duodenal ulcer. I just brought it for only one slide here, because when I discussed last time GI perforations, I have discussed about duodenal ulcer, including giant ulcers. But these are some of the other things today I would like to talk. Iatrogenic after polypectomy, an ERCP in the second part of the duodenum, retroduodenal perforation, something which is missed perforations, trauma, blunt abdominal trauma, gallbladder perforation, and of course bile duct injuries. So when I talk about biliary perforation today, I'll be concentrating except the perforated duodenal ulcer. That is only one or two slides I have brought. Even though it's called as a Graham's repair, all of you know that sudden giving way, the stage of chemical peritonitis, then stage of dilution, then stage of septic peritonitis, guarding, rigidity, air under the free air under the diaphragm. I think diagnosis is easy. You do the resuscitation, and originally described as only a plugging. So Graham actually used a free graft. He just cut the momentum and put it there. But actually described by Selin Jones. So, but somehow credit is given to Graham. But today what we do is usually pedicled ones. So the second time you may have to see, apart from the ulcer, is a polypectomy. More endo work is being done by GI surgeons, gastroenterology people. So, but look at the complication rate of a polypectomy. It's quite high, 10 to 20%. It's more if it is in the duodenum than in the gastric. More for a polyp of a larger size, and more for a sessile polyps. So it's important that a person who undergoes a polypectomy, keep an eye on that early diagnosis. And once you know it's a perforation, the rest of the treatment is like any other. You should decide now whether you are expert in laparoscopy or open, close the perforation, and always the aim is to see that you don't narrow that duodenum there. So you can put the 2 or 3 sutures, whatever PDS, if you have a PDS, you can use there, and with or without momentum, depends upon the. See, the problem is how much deep it is. One of our cases where the perforation happened after 4 days, and in fact this patient went home on the second day, discharged by the gastroenterology, and comes back. Explanation is these are slow cautery burns. These are the cautery burns which has perforated at a later date. So that also should be kept in mind for a late causes. Now what about the sphincterotomy? The perforation occurs in only 1% of the cases, because this is another operation commonly done today to extract the stones. Majority of them are asymptomatic because there is only a retroperitoneal air. They may not complain of anything, but perforations are there. Small papilla stenosis present means there is more risk, tight stenosis. Somebody has taken more time. These are risk factors for completeness of the procedure. Yes, experience counts a lot. One syndrome called as Lamel syndrome is basically a CBD obstruction caused by a large duodenal diverticulum, in that area, obviously, second part near the ampulla, and this itself can perforate. So that's called as Lamel syndrome. So perforations after sphincterotomy involves duodenum. Usually it is retroduodenal portion and you get a retroperitoneal air. But there are three types of it described. It can be a retroperitoneal or it can be intraperitoneal also. Especially this happens when the sphincterotomy extends between the intramural portion of the bile duct. So retroperitoneal air I have already mentioned to you. Those who are asymptomatic, you do the conservative management. And if the bile duct is injured, you may have to do a ERCP, stent it. And there is a last possibility, not only it is the intraperitoneal or retroperitoneal, sometimes there can be a duodenal perforation, which requires obviously adequate treatment. So how to diagnose? If you do a CT scan, you can see the retroperitoneal air here, pneumoperitoneum, which is dissecting the hilum, dissecting the hepatic hilum. So clinical symptoms can be almost as good as pancreatitis, fever, leukocytosis, elevated enzymes will give the diagnosis. So treatment, you know the conservative basic principles of any perforation. You put a nasogastric tube, you look after the bowel care, don't give anything by mouth. Put the basic charts, temperature, pulse, respiration, abdominal girth, and common drugs which you use, and you look after the electrolytes. And 20 to 40% of the patients may require surgery, depends upon the septic focus. And you may have to repair here. If the CBD is completely gone, you may have to do a choledochojejunostomy, and which is very rare for the entire duodenum to get lacerated, or a rare situation of a what is mentioned in the literature is pancreaticoduodenectomy. So just one or two slides on blunt abdominal trauma and duodenal sepsis. So we have mentioned now about duodenal injuries due to polypectomy. Duodenum can get injured, especially second part, as in cases of ERCP or a sphincterotomy. Now, a blunt abdominal trauma can give rise to duodenal injury, especially second part, which is again retroduodenal. You can see here, no? Whenever a patient has got pancreatic injury, you also suspect duodenum. It's almost about 11 to 26%, right? Some of them are actually labeled normal. You know why? Because you take an X-ray, you don't find gas under the diaphragm, and you may take a contrast also, but you may or may not have observed carefully. Only you may report as pancreatic injury, or if there's no pancreatic injury, so they are labeled as normal. But slowly patient develops tachycardia, hypotension, shock, and chest radiograph and plain radiograph is normal. CECT is ultimately gold standard. So if you look at the oral and intravenous contrast media is very sensitive. So you cannot not only diagnose the contrast leak in the retroperitoneum, it can detect the retroperitoneal air, paraduodenal hematoma. So, and more importantly, it can detect the associated other injury. So what do you do for these patients? You have to do a cauterization properly. Then only you'll be able to get into that area. Any injury is there, you have to do a two-layered closure. And provided there's no narrowing of the lumen, resection, anastomosis in case may be required, or a duodenal exclusion if there's a badly injured duodenum. Rare cases, pancreatic or duodenectomy is required. There are few articles showing the late presentation. Patients who come with the sepsis, what you can manage is what's been called a triple tube technique. When there is a duodenal wound is there, so you may have to use 3 tubes. One to drain the stomach called as a gastrostomy tube. One you put a reverse tube in the duodenostomy from the jejunum, go actually reverse, and another is obviously feeding jejunostomy. So that is how you normally treat these patients. Closure of the abdomen in such bad patients where you have put 3 tubes is better to put a mesh laparoscopy. So it facilitates drainage of infectious material. And why you keep the mesh is it prevents the evisceration of the gut, permits visual control of the underlying viscera. So because these are the patients, it may require one more exploration. So that is the reason why you always keep the mesh laparoscopy. So we have covered now biliary bile leak due to duodenum involvement from the duodenal ulcer, duodenal polypectomy, sphincter of Oddi, the whatever instrumentation or a ERCP, etc., sphincterotomy, and a blunt trauma. Now we'll talk about the gallbladder perforation. You know, it's typically seen in acute cholecystitis. Stone is usually responsible, but it is possible that without stone also it can happen. In acalculous cholecystitis, perforation is rare, but can happen in enteric fever. So you should remember, enteric fever is one of the important causes of a gallbladder perforation. No doubt it may be not common, say 3 to 10%. Salmonella has the ability to invade the gallbladder epithelial cells, causing damage to the gallbladder wall, and which then leads to perforation. There is a classification called as Niemer's classification. Early diagnosis and emergency surgical treatment of gallbladder perforation are crucial importance. So upper abdominal CT scan is always done because it may contribute to the preoperative diagnosis of a gallbladder perforation. What it means to say is that you are diagnosed acute cholecystitis and you might have posted the patient for, let us say, early cholecystectomy. But if you were to do a CT scan, you may pick up a perforation. Accordingly, you may plan. That is what it means. So type 1 perforation is a free perforation into the peritoneal cavity. So this happens with the fundus and it requires actually immediately treatment. The second one is a localized. As long as it is confined to one area, such things need not be explored immediately. You can form an alternative form of treatment of a conservative. And lastly, this perforation is, last one is not the septic cause. It is into the viscera. That is one of the reasons why you get that gallstone ileus. It can go into the colon or it can go into the even stomach. So these are few things have been described as far as the fistulae. These are the internal fistula. So look at this site. Usually the fundus. You know why fundus is common site of perforation? Because it is a relatively less blood supply here. You know that cystic artery is a relatively an end artery. So obviously the branch has to reach here. So that's the reason. So this is the area of perforation here. And as I mentioned to you, there's one important thing. If you suspect acute cholecystitis, if you see a gas under the diaphragm, it is probably not gallbladder perforation. Please remember this point. In cases of a gallbladder perforation, you don't get a air under the diaphragm unless there is a separate entity, maybe emphysematous cholecystitis, etc. So when you suspect a patient who has come to the emergency department with the diagnosis of acute cholecystitis and maybe stones are not there, you see gas under the diaphragm, mostly it is a duodenal perforation. This is the one point you should try to understand. So now antibiotics, I think all of you know about cephalosporins, and with or without, depends upon the your again hospital data here. But these patients require a higher antibiotics. Maybe a tazobactam also, piperacillin tazobactam combination. So these are some of the recommendation. The one of the important factors, especially I am talking about gangrenous cholecystitis with sepsis, is that you should start the antibiotic at least 6 hours from the presentation to reduce mortality. Diabetes, elderly patients, and gangrene of the gallbladder, significant mortality is there, can range from even 8 to 20% from delayed cases. So this is one of the important things to be remembered in the diagnosis of gallbladder perforation. So the reasons why antibiotics normally do not work because of the intraperitoneal pus itself has low pH. Phagocytus is also less, and they are polymicrobial. So that is, and there is some kind of a synergistic action between aerobes and anaerobes. So there is necrosis, there is a debris, acidotic medium, all complications you can get in a diabetic patient with a gallbladder perforation can have a serious issue, including empyema. So this has to be taken into consideration. So that these are from some of the recommendation. You feel it's mainly gram-negative aminoglycosides or a combination of these two. And penoms are the next level of antibiotics to be used. So bacteroids may be present, sometimes Clostridia. So antibiotic you cannot say, but generally it is the cephalosporins with or without aminoglycosides, and metronidazole is the combination. So that's the treatment. So in any form of today, laparoscopy is the treatment because it's can diagnose a perforation. You suspect a gangrene of the gallbladder, you have a doubt, patient is not improving with or without stone, you subject the patient for laparoscopy, no harm, because that is one thing which can pick up a pus, gangrene, or even a bile there. So free perforation means definitely immediate surgery, because you see the laparoscopy accuracy is 86 to 100%. Emergency cholecystectomy, again here, if it is easy only, otherwise just do a partial cholecystectomy. Sometimes the entire gallbladder wall is gangrenous, you can't even suture, no problem. Drain the focus out, put drains, and next day ask the medical gastroenterology people to stent the common bile duct. If there's a pus collection in the type 2 perforation, as I mentioned to you, you do a pigtail drainage. So you can see here very gangrenous gallbladder. This kind of a patch which is looking yellow is also called as gangrene. Gangrene does not mean it should be black. Okay, it's only happens in intestine here. So in the gallbladder perforations, you can also see a patch like this. There's an area of ischemia there already perforated, and it's a dangerous condition as I mentioned to you. So it needs to be treated early. So immediate laparotomy. As I told you, this was my case only. Lot of problem, difficult in entering that area. Pus is pouring out, and a few stones were removed. Patient is diabetic. Hyperglycemia was not under control. So I did a partial cholecystectomy, and I could put a small tube inside and put 1 or 2 sutures. It is only for our satisfaction we put that, and more importantly, give a good wash and drain the Rutherford Morrison's pouch, subhepatic drain. So that's what is important in a gangrenous cholecystitis, taking out the septic focus. So with this, we'll talk about now quickly bile duct injuries. When I took the obstructive jaundice, I have talked a little more details, but today I'll be only confining very few slides on this, not all the detail, but as a postgraduate or as clinician, when everything is unusual, you may think that it was the easiest cholecystectomy. That's where sometimes this will happen. Difficult means you would have taken somebody to help, or 2 or 3 minds would have started working. Something which is unusual after a cholecystectomy. He says pain is severe. He also says I got temperature and suddenly tachycardia. If you have kept a drain, there is some bile coming there, or maybe blood. Patient has jaundice, and no doubt a pneumoperitoneum itself causes shoulder pain, but it's a more shoulder pain now. And this one thing which you would have observed that called unusual arrhythmias. This I myself have seen in 2 or 3 cases of increased atrial and ventricular arrhythmias always happen, whenever there's an early biliary sepsis. In fact, they have got a tendency for cardiac arrest. It's very important that to diagnose this early sepsis from bile leak and to treat especially bile duct injuries after cholecystectomy. So these are some of the important causes. As I told you, only area retained stone in the CBD. If it is there, for some reason bile is leaking, you are lucky, you put a ERCP, take out the stone and the stent. There can be many reasons, clips or whatever. So many reasons may be there for the bile leak, which incidents I have quoted there, 0.3 to 2.7 there. Cystic duct clip would have given way, or CBD would have injured, accessory ducts, or so that's what I think. Important things here is to say quick classification. As you know, I won't get into detail, but A means the minor leak from the cystic duct. This is Strasberg. So he's a professor of surgery in St. Louis. So all of you know the critical view of the Strasberg when he was honored. You know that one of the important statements they made was this: it is taught in every general surgery training program in the world, has become the standard of care. That's the reason why I got this photograph here. So you know how to classify Strasberg A, or now they talk about Hanover. That's because it adds more of a vascular things there. These are the figures which are available everywhere. Just to tell you the least here, conservatively you can go, or to a maximum here E, Hilar, etc., etc. So, and Hanover same way here, but he talks more on the, you can see the blue structure and red structure. So portal vein as well as the hepatic artery. So the classification part, I think I will not waste my time. But what is important for all of us to recollect? Whenever there's a bile leak after lap chole, just to find out the drainage. So, but don't be carried away by the drainage. Bile may be accumulating inside. So, but arbitrary figure of 200 means usually it comes down, maybe with the conservative management, daily output, and with antibiotic. But if it is more than 200, it's better that to immediately do an ERCP. So it doesn't matter. You can do it as early as within 24 hours itself. You order a lap chole today. Next day when you come, you see 500 ml of bile in the drain. For some reason you have kept difficult cholecystitis. Do ERCP immediately, because to know the anatomical configuration, ERCP is better, because there may be a stone there, or you would have caused injury, or a clip. Anything is for that matter. So that's what is important, because if there is a injury there, a long stent will immediately cure, because you wait and wait and wait, ultimately the sepsis will develop. And once the sepsis develops, the results of treatment as well as is bad, and mortality. So there's one clip there, you can see here, above which is not going there. So it was actually CBD was transected somewhere there, here. The lower portion is there, somewhere here. You can see the dye going in the lower portion. This is a pancreatic duct. So that's what is, it requires hepatico-jejunostomy. And this was an interesting case where patient had bile leak and it never came down. ERCP, if you see carefully, the bile is flowing there. You can see here. So no transaction, but carefully you watch clips. The almost 2/3 circumference of the CBD area, there are clips there. Additional clips have been applied, maybe a difficult cholecystitis. Normally, I inquired to the surgeon, he has applied totally 6 clips in this lap cholecystectomy. So I can understand that probably there was difficulties, and 2 or 3 were partially on the CBD, no CBD transaction. In fact, we opened it, and I was able to manage suturing there. There was a small hole in the CBD with the T-tube. So that's the Hanover D3 is a very high there, very less than 2.5 centimeter. So that has to undergo hepatico-jejunostomy along with the jejunal loop. So I had discussed in detail when I had taken the obstructive jaundice. Strictures are known. So today one again excellent radiology here. So hepatico-jejunostomy stricture, a PDPD catheter, and dilatation from above, and you can see beautifully the dye. And you may require multiple dilatations, but they do well. Hepatico-jejunostomy you can see here. So what is the summary about the bile leak sepsis? Always remember, first, any sepsis is there means drain with ultrasound and antibiotic. Bile leak more than 200 ml means immediately do the ERCP and stenting. Stones means obviously you will extract. When the patient's condition is not stable, as I mentioned to you, you have to drain somehow, whatever be the date, 6th day, 7th day, 10th day. But don't do the primary repair on 6th day, 7th day, 8th day. Best time to repair is always 6 to 8 weeks later. So these are some of the principles for a bile leak sepsis. So I'll just ask, before I go to the pancreatic sepsis, whatever I have covered, amoebic liver abscess, cholangitis, pyogenic liver abscess, bile leak. If anyone is interested to ask a few questions, please ask. Please unmute yourself and ask any questions with the topics which I have covered.
Yeah, Dr. Iman.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just would like to ask about how do I expect or when do I expect the perforated duodenum to get healed, and when for how long I should wait for this? Thanks.
You are talking about the duodenal injury?
Yes, duodenal perforation, I mean.
Duodenal perforation following what, madam? Following?
For how long should I expect it to heal? Do I need to wait, for example, for 1 month, 2 months, and then I can, if it doesn't heal, like fistula, you know, like fistula, we wait for 6 weeks and
You're
then we
talking
can.
about duodenal ulcer perforation. That is a more complicated one. If the patient has got second time duodenal, first time you need to go in and close whatever the Graham's patch or whatever want you do. But if it goes on leaking again, then do a controlled fistula. Yes, what question you ask? Controlled fistula, feeding jejunostomy. Then you may have to go after 6 to 8 weeks. That is the time nutrition is maintained by feeding jejunostomy, and repair can be done later. Sepsis removal is important. Okay. I hope it's clear.
Okay.
So,
Any more questions from anyone? Okay, thank you.
yeah, so we will now take the intra-abdominal sepsis due to pancreatic necrosis. As I told you, pancreas is also in the abdomen only. It's also part of the GI system, but it's not a hollow viscous. That also you can't say there's a duct there, but these I kept it separate. And I am not going to talk all about acute pancreatitis, which itself is a major one. So this is important for you to realize the Atlanta classification or modified Atlanta. So this one chart, if you remember, it tells you so many things here. There is one early phase and a late phase. Some of them can develop within early itself, mild features with severity wise, mild, moderate, severe, and edematous or necrotizing. So we will concentrate somewhere in the last category only here, necrotizing pancreatitis. So whenever you have a necrosis documented by CT scan, you don't have to document infection here. Let us say there is necrosis. It falls under necrotizing pancreatitis. When it is within 4 weeks, it's called as acute necrotic collection. If it is beyond 4 weeks, it's called as walled-off necrosis. That is the first thing you should understand. And if it is edematous pancreatitis, less than 4 is the typical. Most of the time what we see is a collection, fluid collection. And if it is beyond 4 weeks, this is called a pseudocyst to the pancreas, which you know, the typical localized collection in the lesser sac without epithelial lining. All of you know about that. So it's important for us to diagnose this necrotizing pancreatitis, which may happen in 8 to 10% of the patients, or sometimes more. But just to give you quick glimpses of to diagnosis, this is after laparotomy, one case of a fat necrosis. You can, these are little old photographs. Nowadays, you don't open the pancreatitis patient. You have lots of imaging and image guided only you do. So some of the Gray Turner sign clinical diagnosis for the flank discoloration there. This is the retroperitoneal seepage of the blood along the retroperitoneum anterabdominal wall. And Cullen sign is the one which is near the umbilical view there. This is abdominal distension. Plain X-ray finding of a sentinel loop sign. This is what I meant by necrosis. Again, Balthazar criteria, I think postgraduate should know, rough idea, 1/3 or half or 3/4 or whole circum. The entire pancreas is gone, depends upon you classify. Usually they come under 10, Balthazar 10, and this is the infected necrosis where you can see the air there. It's not mandatory to make a diagnosis of infected necrosis based on only on the air. You always see the patient that how good or how bad. So as I mentioned to you last time, I put some scoring systems in the part 1. So I think you have to put one scoring system. You put Apache or you put Ranson's, but they are for early, late admission. But this is better, and you confirm the diagnosis. CT severity index I mentioned to you. Immediately do the resuscitation. So a debate of the early enteral, as long as patient can tolerate oral fluids, not much of abdominal distension, no pain abdomen, no vomiting, you can give clear fluids in the initial part of nutrition. If there is any stone causing cholangitis and pancreatitis, you know that this is a case for emergency retrograde ERCP and extraction of the stone, and that's the treatment. Now the question is interventions, and what are the indications? Everyone knows that infected necrosis is definitely an indication, but you may find a sterile necrosis and patient is not improving. In spite of your treatment, there are collections, bleeding, fistulae, persistent systemic inflammatory response syndrome, including organ failure. So, but also you should remember the necrosectomy part. We'll study 1 or 2 trials there. A patient here, you can see a nasojejunal tube. He had a duodenal obstruction due to a large peripancreatic phlegmon there with necrosis. He was not tolerating oral, so a nasojejunal tube. Another case was a pancreatic abscess there. So you can make out I'll come to the initial percutaneous drainage. You can see here, there's some kind of a muddy like fluid which is accumulated there, and you can see here large collection. It's almost in the left subphrenic area or left posterior inferior area. Yes, so that's where the collection was there, and tube has been put. So now I think as postgraduates you should know what is called a step-up approach, which is now almost popular. So we'll talk about a little bit of step-up approach. So it is done usually 4 to 6 weeks later. Initially there's a drainage. So you identify an area, put a drain that fluid on the left side, subcostal area. Patient improves, you buy some time, that's what it is. And then you go in and do either a minimal access, that is a laparoscopic one, or you are not expert, you do a open. We'll come to the trials there. And that's a necrosectomy material, and that's a necrosectomy bed, is an open case. So I would like all of you to sensitize to 2 studies on this. One is a PANTER trial. This refers to pancreatitis, necrosectomy. Then you see step, they have taken the T from there and R from here. So that's okay. So easy to remember, PANTER trial. And they did the 2 randomization here. That's one of the important you should remember. So group A as well as group B here. And I think this Biomedicare Center, that's what BMC refers to. It's basically a Dutch groups in a multi-center. So group A, they did a step up and they did the ward. So these are some of the words the postgraduate should have a clear picture. That's a video assisted retrograde debridement, or they call it as a minimum, or you can say maximum necrosectomy when they mean by laparotomy. So that's what, so what they have done in the drainage. So as I mentioned to you, left side you put a 12 French catheter, You can put multiple drain, no harm. Rarely it's a transpirator or rarely endoscopic because you can't do it. Sometimes what happens is sometimes they will tell spleen is coming in the way, colon is coming in the way. So that time you can ask the endosonologist, endoscopist. Then you keep flushing it, 50 ml saline you take, and that's what is done. These are some of the fundamental steps. Article you can read on this. You put this, you will get the full article, or you just put Panther trial, you will get the article. Once you are done, with this, you have no time. Patient is improving. Another 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you are going to do necrosectomy. Whatever drain you have put there, you with the finger you go in again there. It's all can be done under local only there, supine position, or if necessary, and you go in and later put a drain there, or go deeper, go to the now area, explore, and of course anesthesia is required, and take out all that material. Necrosectomy is performed, then 10 mm trocar and 10 mm 0 degree videoscope is used, and whatever that is loose you remove. So step up approach is basically initial drainage followed by video assisted retroperiodic debridement. This is one arm. Another arm was same. First one is step up approach only, second part is open. So what did they conclude? The few important things are interesting. It is not necessary to remove all necrotic tissue. That's important here. It is therefore not the goal. What you remove is only a peripancreatic necrosis or merely infected fluid. By performing drainage of the infected fluid under pressure, the clinical condition may improve. The necrotic tissue may be successfully be dealt by the patient's immune system itself. So these are some of the important observations here. So they also found out the major morbidity is less in this trial. So what are the two important messages from this is the morbidity is less, major, and it is not necessary to take out all that is one. Loose pancreatic necrotic portion only should be removed. Then came this tension trial. It's a transluminal, basically endoscopic step-up approach. So here you find 98 patients in that enrolled, 51 and 47, and they found out the mortality did not differ in both groups, and they ultimately concluded in the tension trial that in future there is a definite possibility that it will go away from the minimal access surgeon to endoscopist. So that is what can happen. It's an endoscopic step-up approach. This article is in the Lancet. So those who are, I think you should read about this. There is one more article which has come. I have not included for you. So maybe Dr. Patta Radhakrishna will explain to you. So, but please remember, basically, these are the two trials. Sometimes they will ask you. One is a important trial is a Panther trial, and the second one is a tension trial, right? So treatment of acute pancreatitis with the pancreatic necrosis, when I say infected necrosis, basic principle, because it's 4 to 6 weeks, you can't go on giving the patient TPN. Oral, you should possible as soon as possible. Worst comes a nasojejunal feed. Infected necrosis needs to be drained. You have to do it only after 4 weeks, a drainage, then do the debridement. Only one indication where you may have to do a distal pancreatectomy or whatever. Sometimes the distal pancreatic duct may disconnect. That situation may warrant a removal of that portion of the pancreas. So these are some of the important aspects about the pancreatic sepsis. So again, if you have any question, because pancreatic necrosis is a it's an important topic, lot of debates and lot of doubts you may have. Dr. Radhakrishnan is also here. So if you have any questions related, please ask related to pancreatic necrosis. There's no point in asking all about acute pancreatitis. So postgraduate, if you have any questions, please ask now. Yes.
Any
Hello?
questions, please?
Pancreatic necrosis.
Actually, there are couple of lectures on pancreatic necrosis alone, sir. So I think
So
they
no
must be
problem.
thorough with
So,
that.
so now we will take up the urosepsis. As I mentioned to you, urosepsis may not be the truly that way intra-abdominal, but they are the portions, and every surgeon should know all about the urosepsis. So that's a severe infection of the urinary tract, and of course including the prostate. I have seen a prostate abscess patient diagnosed as a dengue fever in a 55-year-old diabetic. Prostate is enlarged, and missing the examination or specifically look for the prostate. He had a little difficulty in micturition and frequency, which was thought due to diabetes. And he went on treating with antibiotics, only to realize that he went in for a multiple organ failure and turned out to be a prostatic abscess. So it should be kept in mind in men. The usual systemic inflammatory response syndrome will present multi-organ failure. See, you see how bad it can be, hypoperfusion to hypotension and shock. So also remember, in the hospital, there is enough case of nosocomial infection because of instrumentation, catheterization, etc. Last but not the least, always remember women than in men, especially urosepsis. So what is the important conditions here? For you to read the more details, these are the common problems. So especially diabetic patients and instrumentation, calculus disease, all can give rise to acute pyelonephritis and a urosepsis. Diagnosis is based on the typical features. You examine the abdomen, you may not have, but you may have tenderness near the flank. You may diagnose as pancreatitis. This is what really happens. He may have pain in the right flank. You are diagnosed as a liver abscess because you have forgotten there's something called as a renal system there. So tachycardia, tachypnea, there's something called as respiratory alkalosis. Usually the gram-negative sepsis of the conditions which are in case of abdomen, usually you find a acidosis. There's alkalosis there. There's a leukocytes, and E. coli is the main organism. Basic principle of any urosepsis is third generation cephalosporins and fluoroquinolines. You know, you can use ciprofloxacin or levofloxacin, etc. These are the common drugs which are used. So how do you diagnose acute pyelonephritis? I think all of you know. Always there is some obstruction, either a stone or ascending infection or septic focus, caries tooth, anything in the body. High grade fever, flank pain, flank tenderness, and female. Adding on to that, it will be acute pyelonephritis. E. coli produces acidic, Proteus produces alkaline urine. So that's what is the important things. Three things you should rule out: reflux, diabetes, and obstruction, whatever be the form of obstruction. Now, more dangerous than acute pyelonephritis is this form of emphysematous pyelonephritis. So all of you know, these are the common causes. There's a gas forming organisms are not necessarily only Clostridium. Anaerobic streptococci also can give rise to gas, E. coli, Proteus. So that's what is the typical diagnosis, and immediate treatment is required. Either a percutaneous, really you relieve the obstruction, or rarely percutaneously drainage, endourology and relieve the obstruction, or maybe nephrectomy. So you can see there, you can see that air surrounding the kidney there, typical emphysematous pyelonephritis, and you can see here that's a typical emphysematous pyelonephritis. So what are the invasive conditions which normally all of you know? Instruments are very common, whether it's a catheterization, dilatation, or whatever, ECNL, nephrostomy, cystoscopy. Most of the nephrologists, urologists are endourologists today. So you get all this. High-risk patients are elderly, diabetic. Many of them are immunocompromised. They may be having renal transplant, they may AIDS. So anti-cancer drugs, immunosuppression. So that's all. These are the various causes for a pyelonephritis. So the treatment, as I mentioned to you, you have to antibiotics, drain, and rarely when the kidney is the focus of sepsis, pus, whether it's a pyonephrosis or whatever, that's an nephrectomy. Now renal or a perirenal abscess, again same causes here, but one point I would like to highlight is this. What has been mentioned as papillary necrosis. This happens in diabetic even without any of those stone infection instrumentation. So you see the diabetic patients are vulnerable for all sorts of infections. Papillary necrosis, more dangerous condition. You see that sloughed papillae, they all go down. They themselves cause obstruction and they can produce urinomas, septic kidney itself. All complications can happen. Like we mentioned, a prostatic abscess, that's also common in diabetics, can occur spontaneously without any specific precipitate cause. All these are source of infection. Urosepsis and cholangitis, two things you should always remember in a woman, because both are incidence wise more common, have to be kept in mind when patient has got septic shock. So this is prostatic abscess. As I mentioned to you, diabetes is the must. Like a carbuncle, we say, exclusively occur in diabetes. So this is a prostatic abscess. They may have some pelvic pain, some micturition, passing some threads-like thing in the urine. So transrectal drainage of the abscess and antibiotic is the treatment. Before you treat a prostatic abscess, always rule out, because obviously this is in men, and alcoholic rectal varices. I have seen patients where prostatic abscess, somebody drained through the rectum, and patient came with the massive bleeding, and it took very, very long time and trouble to control that bleed, because it has gone through the rectal varices in a portal hypertension patient. So many patients are taking anticoagulants also. So this has to be kept in mind before you treat a prostatic abscess. So urosepsis, as I mentioned to you, pyelonephritis, including of course stone, I have mentioned to you. Any stone means it has to be removed. Perinephric collections, perinephric abscess, emphysematous pyelonephritis, prostatic abscess, etc. My last group of talks is confined to obstetric and gynec sepsis and surgeon. Again, recently there was a talk, but I, as a general surgeon, so many times I have called to assist the obstetric and gynec sepsis. So I thought I should include few things like a primary pneumococcal peritonitis. Young girls are commonly affected. Basically, it's a malnourishment, bloody diarrhea, micturition issues. Diagnosis is by you drain the peritoneal fluid, and counts are very high. So that is what is the treatment: laparotomy and drain the pus. So today it is we don't come across much in well-developed. It's mainly poorly nutrition, I think, is the main source of, and hygiene. These are responsible for pneumococcal peritonitis. This is again a parturition. So deliveries, abortions, attempted abortions, all this can give rise to hygiene. Again, the factor here. So they can be localized or generalized peritonitis. So treatment according to the culture sensitivity, broad spectrum antibiotics. One other condition where you may be called often right iliac fossa pain to rule out appendicitis. This all could be due to tumor ovarian. Usually it's bilateral. All these comes under category of what has been called as pelvic inflammatory conditions. So 10% of them are due to intrauterine devices, whether it's a copper T or any other, and is a independent risk factor, presence of a intrauterine device. So some of the sexually active, menstruating, non-pregnant women are more vulnerable for PID. Tuberculosis, I think all of you know, is one of the causes also for a PID. May not produce a septic focus like this, like a sepsis, but it can be a part of the PID. But more important is about the gonorrhea. This is the one which can produce severe sepsis because it can give rise to fulminant hypotension, shock, etc. Prevalence of the genital TB is about 1 to 2%. So typically, pain in the hypochondrium, pain in the lower abdomen, vaginal discharge. These are some of the findings what you find in a obstetric or a gynec sepsis. One syndrome you should probably, they can ask you what is Fitz-Hugh-Curtis syndrome. It's upper quadrant pain. There is a liver capsular inflammation here with some lot of adhesions. Perihepatitis, there are more shoulder pain, and if you put a laparoscope, you may find some string-like adhesions. So that's a typical of a Fitz-Hugh-Curtis syndrome. So that is a basically seen in a pelvic inflammatory disease. So big list of investigations are here, but typically all of you know that any smear means you have to take a swab culture. One problem of whenever there is a salpingo-oophorytis, etc., the CA-125 gets elevated in both, you know, in tuberculosis also and in tumors also, especially ovarian cancer. So that is one of the important things one should be taken care of. High CA-125, you don't suspect really a ovarian cancer. It could be tuberculosis. That has to be kept in mind. Of course, at the end you have a series of investigation, transvaginal ultrasound, etc. But ultimately, laparoscopy is the gold standard. You can evaluate the tubes, edema, exudate, all those fibrous adhesions, etc. So what is the mainstay? Antibiotic and 14 days of antibiotic, including anaerobic cover. Yes, female genital tract, again here, doxycycline, gentamicin, clindamycin. So various combinations are there for the treatment of a pelvic inflammatory disease. So this is may not be truly an obstetric gynec sepsis, but I think all of you know that, with the due apology, that MOPS are often, we find that they are retained either from a cesarean section where, you know, to save 2 lives, mother and child, in a hurry, the count might have been missed, or maybe hysterectomy, whatever be the reason. So what has been called as incidental omas, like, you know, gossipy biomas. So this is a lady who undergoes abdominal hysterectomy. 3 months later comes with the ill health. Later she finds pus pouring out from the wound. Investigation revealed a MOP. You know, these are the legal suits, can go up from lakhs to 1 crore also. So it's important that, you know, one should be extremely careful that mention the, you know, better to have a count of these MOPs and gauze pieces, etc. in all. So you can see here, such a large MOP, it was stuck in the right iliac fossa. And I have seen also another patient having a MOP eroded through the intestine, causing some amount of feculent fluid. So this is important to realize that I have also seen another case of a MOP following an open cholecystectomy. There was some bleeding. Somebody went and packed. So it's not that, but more MOPs I have seen following a lower abdominal surgery. Now, you see this patient. She came with the vaginal hysterectomy, referred to hospital, high-grade fever. She was having sepsis, illness, and vaginal discharge, suprapubic pain. There was tachycardia, temperature, and if you see CT, these are all air pockets. Diagnosis of the MOP is easily done because those in between the air is trapped there. And I explored this I had to put a suprapubic incision because the gynec people said they can't reach from below. So it was a intraperitoneal collection of almost 6 or 8 gauze pieces. Maybe from the vault it was bleeding out, vaginal hysterectomy. They went on trying to take a gauze and so they pushed it and it has entered into the peritoneal cavity. So these are few things which can happen. So it has to be kept in mind. So that's where I completed my part 2 of the intra-abdominal sepsis, which is covering the liver, including cholangitis, biliary tract including sphincterotomy or a duodenal perforation, which is retroduodenal, pyogenic liver abscess, yes. I also mentioned about bile leak, some of the dictums of how to manage a bile leak, pancreatic necrosis, source of infection, and few important conditions of the urosepsis and obstetric and gynec. So with this now abdomen is Pandora's box, I think all of you know. It's important that we make a diagnosis of a sepsis. When acute abdominal pain is the main symptom, you actually think that it could be an abdominal sepsis. When the pain is not the first feature, it can be something else. It can be a liver abscess or it can be urosepsis. It presents straight away with the high-grade chills and trigers, hypotension and shock, more so in diabetics. GI perforations like a holoviscus and gangrene, relatively easy to make a diagnosis. But it's important that we should not miss these causes. Ruptured liver abscess, retroduodenal perforation to be kept in mind. Cholangitis and urosepsis always in a diabetic patient, more so in women. Thank God, imaging has made a great difference, not only in the diagnosis. Today, whether it's a liver abscess, pyogenic abscess, as I mentioned about pancreatic necrosis, they are all interventions, whether it's done by a gastroenterologist or a radiologist. So the life has become relatively easy. So these are some of the references, and that's where I end my talk. And thank you for a patient hearing, and take care of yourself. So if there are any questions, please unmute and ask.
A wonderful lecture, sir, as always. Complete and thorough, and you don't leave anything to chance.
Possible, they should be able to write as a theory major question.
Anyone, any questions to Professor Sharma?
All these are important topics, including cholangitis and pancreatic necrosis. I have also heard that lecture in the channel, but then I thought I'll just put a few slides.
Yeah, so definitely. That will complete the
make them sensitize that two trials. At least the postgraduates also should have idea, should know what to write in the paper. So,
did Anjali have a comment?
Comments also welcome.
Yes, sir. Excellent lecture, sir.
Madam, feel free to suggest or modify anything, because
no, sir,
you are senior.
A wonderful lecture for even a clinician, sir. If the time permits, sir, if we have time, sir, I will illustrate one gynec case, how that has turned up. Do we have the time, Patta, sir? Fine.
Yeah, you can.
Yes, sir. In that gynec scenario, one patient of age 34 years, she presented in the 9 months. She was about to deliver within 1 week period. EDD was expected 7 weeks, 7 days ahead. She was complaining of per-rectal pain. Only complaint was per-rectal pain. The gynecologist initially thought that she is about to deliver, and later on she has done the obstetric ultrasound. It was normal. She haven't done the CBC count that time. Patient next week, after 2 days, she had developed a severe high-grade fever, sir. For that, she was referred to a surgeon. The surgeon had done the PR examination and all. On PR examination, only positive thing was that per rectal examination, there was a bit high fever, which you could feel internally that there was something burning inside. Your finger was feeling very hot. And again, they sent the patient to a radiologist. They could not recollect it. And patient delivered the next day, sir. Patient delivered next day. She delivered around 2 liter pus. And that pus was pouring and pouring. And actually, the pus came out through the rectum also, sir, per vaginal also. And baby was IUD. On that same day, gynecologist called another gynecologist for the help. They haven't called the surgeon, sir. Another gynecologist, they gave the thorough washing. Patient was given 3 days antibiotic. After that, she was settled and she was sent home, sir. After going home, after 5 days, she developed a fever, sir. Again, high grade fever. For that patient, again has given a call to the obstetric and gynec person from the home that she was having fever. Again, that gynecologist has given a doxycycline and all that stuff to her. After 2 days, she developed all vesicles all over the abdomen, sir. All vesicles, and that those vesicles were containing a foul smelling discharge and all a tea colored like vesicle, which was the gangrenous vesicle, sir. And then she turned out into the hospital. There was a very much foul smell from the breath, all over secretions. Then that patient was referred to me, sir. Then in that scenario, I have admitted that patient into the ICU, sir. We have done all the debridement. It was actually a necrotizing fasciitis, and that is basically ischiorectal abscess, which was undiagnosed. That has become pelvic abscess, that has eroded all the peritoneal layers, and that has now spread into the anterior abdominal wall. And after completely 3 months period, sir, patient was fully recovered. Her total anterior abdominal wall was lost, sir. Till rectus, nothing was there, sir. We haven't done the colostomy. She came out of that. And after that, abdominoplasty was done finally, sir. And now the patient is all right. So a small mistake can lead to a disaster, sir.
That is what, madam, what you told is correct, because these are things which one should be. This is only because we means whoever not examined the patient properly.
Yes,
See,
sir.
the CT is there, ultrasound is there, so we take it for granted that there
Yes.
is something there.
Yes.
If you were to carefully examine and a careful reference, probably they could have solved this issue.
Yes. Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Dr. Rajesh, you have a comment? Anyone else wants to say something? So there are no comments, sir. Thank you again for a wonderful lecture.
Thank
Till-
you, sir.
Till we see
Thank
you
you.
in the next lecture.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank
Have a nice evening. I think you should get prepared for your other recording. Thank
Thank
you. Thanks.
Thank you.